A core feature of Forge is the ability to invoke APIs so that your app can interact with other apps. For example, you may want your Forge app to retrieve information from an Atlassian app such as Jira or Confluence in order to display it to users. Alternatively, your Forge app may need to update data in an Atlassian app. Forge apps can also invoke the APIs of non-Atlassian apps, which is useful when integrating with other systems. Let's take a look at some of the details about how Forge apps can invoke APIs. First, let's discuss the concept of managed credentials. Since Forge takes care of the hosting of apps, it knows when and where apps are active. This means that when a Forge app wants to invoke an Atlassian API, Forge knows which customer instance it is active in, and therefore Forge is able to completely take care of the credentials needed by the app to invoke Atlassian APIs. Your app doesn't need any API keys or tokens to invoke Atlassian APIs because the Forge platform adds them when needed. This makes your app code much simpler and more secure because it doesn't need to store and retrieve credentials. Forge also extends the concept of managed credentials to non-Atlassian APIs that use OAuth 2 authentication. For these APIs, Forge will automatically take users through the OAuth flow and store the API tokens as necessary. A user is associated with every Atlassian API invocation in order to restrict the authorization of the API call to the user's privileges. The user associated with the API call can either be the user using the app or a fake user that is associated with the app and created when the app is first installed. When a Forge app invokes an Atlassian API from its user interface, the call is always associated with the user that the Forge user interface is active for. When a Forge app invokes an Atlassian API from a Forge function, which is the same as saying Forge runtime, the app may have a choice as to which user's permissions should be used for the call. If the Forge function is being executed in direct response to a user action, it's best to choose to invoke the API call as that user. If the Forge function is not being executed in direct response to a user action, there may still be hints about which user indirectly caused the Forge function to be invoked. To determine this, look at the context parameter that is passed to your Forge function to see if it contains user information. If the user information is found, your Forge function could use this to make an API call as this user. This is called user impersonation. The last option is for the Forge function to invoke the Atlassian app as the user associated with the Forge app. Here's some typical code detailing an API call. The snippet at the top is an example of API scopes that you will need to add to your app manifest. You need to look at the API documentation to determine which scopes your app will need. The bottom snippet is the API call itself. Expanding it, we can see that we need to import some code from the Forge API package. The asUser function indicates the call should be made using the permissions of the user that directly cause the function to execute. The request Jira function indicates that we are calling the Jira REST API. We also see that there is no need to specify the URL of the customer site being invoked because Forge knows this and will ensure the right customer site is invoked. You just need to specify the path to the API endpoint being invoked. In this case, we are invoking the endpoint that retrieves account details about the user making the request. When you compare this code with typical code used to call an API, it's much simpler because there's no need to retrieve an API token from a data store and to refresh it if it's expired. There's also no need to work out the absolute URL of the API. You just need to specify the endpoint, which is detailed in the API documentation. Calling an Atlassian API from a Forge user interface is similar, but even easier. Here we are importing the request Jira function from the Forge bridge package, and there's no need to specify we are making a call as the active user, because this is always the case for calls made from Forge user interfaces. When calling non-Atlassian APIs, there are two options. If the API you are calling supports OAuth 2, you need to add the details about the API's OAuth configuration in your app's manifest. This allows Forge to manage the OAuth tokens that are necessary to call the API, just like Forge does when calling Atlassian APIs. If the external API doesn't support OAuth 2 but requires an API key, you will need to store the API key in an encrypted Forge environment variable and add it to the API call yourself. You can use the standard node fetch function to make these API calls. The presentation app I'm using here is a Forge app. One of its features is the ability to add photos to slides just by specifying keywords or a phrase and using Unsplash to find a related photo. The snippet from the app's manifest at the top shows how the app requests the ability to make requests to the Unsplash API. Without this, Forge would block the requests. The second snippet shows the code required to make the API call. Let's walk through the code required in a little more detail. The illustration on the right shows the component at each phase. The code is triggered by the presenter navigating to a slide that needs to display an Unsplash image. The app's UI code invokes a function in its backend. This is done by defining a resolver. The app's function then retrieves the API key needed by the Unsplash API. The function then uses the node fetch function to invoke the Unsplash API. The Unsplash API key and keywords are added to the query parameters to the API's URL. The API response is then read. Like many APIs, the Unsplash API encodes the response data as JSON. The API's response data is then saved in the app's front-end state. The last phase involves the rendering of the image using the data returned from the Unsplash API. Here's the demo of the code in action. Unsplash has found an image relating to the keyword moon. So hopefully now you have a better understanding of how to invoke APIs from a Forge app. If you're ready to get started, try Forge out today by visiting the URL on this screen.